All right, thank you for joining me today. I think you've been with me before on a Wednesday call, but just to introduce, my name is John Vanett, and I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here in Germany. Welcome. The purpose of our Wednesday calls is to try to talk about a different sort of topic related to HS and tools and development and so on, taking an hour each week to talk about a different topic. The topic today is sort of having trouble putting it into one term, but common answers or answers to common questions, especially difficult questions or resistant questions to the use of either HS tools or sort of diagnostic methods for things like leadership development, measuring organizational culture, team development, and so on. So there are obviously a lot of, when you think about development, whether it's culture or any other, we're talking about typically a fairly long journey. So, there are two different sort of topics. One is what we're focusing on today, which is kind of the initial, we would say, at least in where we come into contact with clients, resistance to the idea of measurement, data-driven approaches, and sort of the value of using those tools. The other, and oftentimes quite closely related types of resistance that we see in organizations to actually, either their receptivity to this data once once we deliver reports, or their ability to sort of implement and move forward, and the challenges that they experience with that. Obviously, those things are related in some ways to the concerns that they have in the beginning. But I'm just really focusing on sort of that initial piece of resistance to sort of measurement and data-driven approaches. Good. So in that case, from our perspective, where that means these questions are primarily coming from what we would call our end user clients. So even though, of course, we work through a very large network of accredited consultants and practitioners, these kinds of questions are usually coming from the end users using the tools. And also, by the way, and we can talk about this as we go through, they typically come from two groups within the organization. Some of these questions are going to come from leadership teams that we're in touch with, again, on the topic of culture and leadership development, or these questions are typically coming from a part of the organization responsible for these things, such as HR, OD, learning and development, those sorts of functional areas of the business. So it seems to be that, and we can come back to this, that the concerns that leaders have versus HR and OD have are slightly different, and that leads to different questions being asked and different concerns and sort of roadblocks before we can move ahead with projects and delivering reports. Okay, the other thing, a couple things I wanted to point out before we get into the actual questions is things are changing very happily. And what I mean by that is the kinds of questions that we get from clients have changed significantly over the years. I remember talking to Dr. Cook about this in terms of, the 1970s and 80s, but to be honest with you, even in my comparatively short tenure with HS of 10 or 12 years, the kinds of questions that people were asking 10 years ago about leadership and culture are not the kinds of questions that they're asking today. Back then, it was things like, does culture actually exist? And does it actually influence the performance of our people? And can you prove it? And these sorts of things. And of course, yes, we can, and we have lots of information on that. But the point is that I'm going to focus on questions that are sort of more current and relevant to the projects that we see today. And I think it's a good thing that, and this actually goes back to Sean McCarthy's sort of levels of organizational consciousness, that the conversation about leadership and culture is changing, and it's moving from those sort of lower levels of consciousness where we sort of aren't aware of things like culture to higher levels of awareness where organizations recognize that this is a thing and that it influences their performance, and they might be well advised to understand what it is, how it's playing out, and even have useful information in terms of how to influence or guide that culture. Good. What else? Oh, the other point I wanted to make is that while these are sort of responses to arguments that our clients have or concerns that clients have, This is not intended to be sort of, we don't, my point is we don't push our instruments, we don't push sales basically. We work to create an interest in organizations around the research that we do and the clients who benefit from our tools. The purpose here is really not to try to get someone to buy an instrument. Even if we are successful in that, the likelihood that they'll really benefit from it in a way that's meaningful and sustainable is pretty slim. So a lot of psychology and development is this way. You sort of have to wait until the individual or the client is ready to change before you can help them. So at times we have to be a little bit patient. And to be honest with you, before we get into how to answer the no's of using diagnostic tools, one of my answers is, you know, sort of is they don't have to. And by the way, by the time I get into touch with them on these topics, they probably already have. Like, they've tried to develop leaders without instruments already. They've considered the issue of culture and tried to look into it without our tools already. It's usually the learnings that they take away from that lead them to value having some good data. So, you know, in one way, if they don't want to use a diagnostic tool to look at culture and leadership, and I've had this conversation with clients, you know, then go ahead and use the methods that you feel are most useful and appropriate. Let me check in with you in a year or two and see how that's going. And a lot of times in a year, then we've learned that there's some missing pieces that we need, and that's what we then can help to deliver. So the first one is probably the one that I get the most often, to be honest with you. And this is, there's too much change going on right now. We have too many projects going on right now. This is very interesting, and we could see that it might be helpful, but there's just too many moving pieces at this point. We can't possibly address it. So I like to answer this one in a couple of different ways. I actually put 2 points, one with regard to change and the other with regard to sort of too many projects and too many initiatives going on. In the case of change, there are a few things that I like to talk to clients about. There's usually a conversation going on there, but the first thing that I have to say is this is the most frequent sort of pushback that I get from clients initially around the use of tools, or really even looking into leadership or culture development. There's too much going on right now for us to do this. The pace of change, by the way, is something that I've talked to organizations and leaders about for years. And one thing that I can tell you is it's not slowing down. Change is continuing. I think we all see this. And it just doesn't make sense to think that we can wait until there's a convenient time at which things sort of settle down, and then we can focus on this culture leadership topic. The other point that I like to make here is that change can be an advantage. One of the interesting things to talk to clients about is how they're perceiving that change, right? It shouldn't necessarily be negative, but a lot of what they're talking about is, you know, there's so much change and confusion and so on that it's distracting our abilities from addressing these topics. In my opinion, these tools are very useful in times of change. I like to use them before change takes place because of the predictive nature of the instrument. Means you can understand how our people and our teams and our organization is going to respond to the changes that are upcoming. And that's extremely useful in things like merger and acquisitions, or for some of our clients who are using OCI before the COVID-19 situation in home office. They were actually able to understand how our teams are going to function and which teams are going to have difficulty to continue to work together based on that remote work environment. So the predictive nature of the tools is very good. So kind of the sooner the better. The other point is that it doesn't make sense to wait for change to stop to use these tools, because these tools are going to ask you to change. That's the nature of the instruments. The purpose of them is to learn from them and hopefully create some change. So the fact that you're changing right now is probably just about the right time that you should be using these, so that hopefully, again, we get information from the tools about how best to change, and not only what we could be doing more of to move ahead more easily, but as we change, what are we doing that's holding us back and making this change so difficult? Understanding that is I think, very valuable in the change context. The last thing I like to talk about change in organizations has to do with what is changing. And that's a lot of what I like to talk to clients about is, where is this change happening? Usually what they'll describe to you, if you're familiar with our tools and our how culture works model, is they'll describe that the climate is changing and perhaps also outcomes are changing. So our goals are changing, they're changing roles and responsibilities, and maybe we're changing performance appraisals and KPIs and how we assess performance, and all of that is changing. What they're describing, if you look at our models and how culture work, is sort of everything around the employee, right? Their job and how it's designed and how the business sets goals and how we communicate a good job versus a bad job, and all those sorts of things. That is true, but let's take a minute to add in the cultural piece, and especially the leadership piece, if I can try to make this point. Change is difficult in defensive organizational cultures, and if you work with defensive leaders and leadership teams, because not only are the goals changing and the job might be changing, and what we're aiming for in terms of KPIs is changing, you know, and in leadership is changing. That's climate too, right? We have leaderships changing. Okay, but in a defensive organization, the employee will also say things like, while that's all difficult, it's also frustrating that with this leader, they expected me to work towards these goals and to solve problems and to get things done and to take accountability. But then they left and the new leader comes, and the new leader expects me to sit in my office and do what I'm told and follow the checklist and compliance and not speak up and so on. And then that leader leads and the next leader comes in and they expect me to get everything done personally and outperform my team and to compete against them. And it's that kind of change in organizations in terms of what is expected of me that is more, I would suggest, more disruptive to your people than the changes in things like climate and you know, the KPIs we're aiming for and so on. So the point is that if we can use these tools to create a somewhat more constructive culture or align leaders so that they lead in more constructive ways, then yes, while goals and accountability and job design are changing and KPIs are changing and my leaders are changing, at least with my former leader, they wanted me to work towards goals and get things done and take responsibility and learn and share and take care of my team. And even though I have a new leader and the goals and strategy have changed, they still expect me to approach that goal and strategy with the same kind of culture. They're still expecting me to work towards those goals and take initiative and solve problems and learn from what I'm doing and to work with the people that I'm working with. And regardless of sort of what changes in the system and design and objectives of the business, there is a consistency in how we get there and how we achieve those things. And that's the kind of consistency within all that change that seems to be very helpful for people and make them more resilient to change. And by the way, we have tons of research on how constructive behavioral patterns help people to adapt effectively in a way that's not as stressful to them as individuals and is actually effective in creating and implementing change. Good. By the way, just as a side note, we have a client who uses GSI to predict the ability of teams to change. And this is for a digitalization project, sort of an exotic example, but interesting. So they'll use GSI with various IT teams in organizations who are about to be sort of upgraded to a completely new digital platform. And based on how those teams behave and work, they're able to predict which of these teams is going to be most capable of adapting effectively to the new way of working. And this has to do in teams with self-actualization and achievement and humanistic patterns, and which teams, especially those conventional ones, that are really going to struggle to do things differently and break the mold. And they're able to then proactively go in and support those teams that are going to need a little extra help to adapt versus those that have the kind of behavior that predicts they'll be able to manage it. So that's the kind of very nice predictive relationship that is useful when you're going through change, especially beforehand. Okay. Let me get to the next part B of item 1, which is too many initiatives, too many projects. This is very frequent. I have a client I'm talking to every week about this, and you know, their leaders are, you'll notice in a lot of these organizations that they'll report that they're a bit overwhelmed. There are so many things going on. We just rewrote our value statements. We have new KPIs we're working toward. We're bringing new people on board. We're redesigning. You know, there's so much sort of taking place that they begin to, first of all, I think they begin to lose perspective of how everything fits together. So to be honest with you, and this goes back to the last Wednesday call, I think, where I talked about how to introduce HS models, and especially the how culture works model and the define, design, do, deliver kind of puzzle piece that we work through. I do this with clients because what it helps them to do is to realize that all of their different initiatives sort of fit into one overall dashboard of the organization. And I use the how culture works model. This not only lets them see that values are right over here in our ideal, and this is where we espouse them in our mission and philosophy, and where leaders fit and where our KPIs are and how the whole thing connects. But it allows them to align these things and to realize that certain things, I hate to say, are sort of outside of the touch of the leadership. So for example, one group I'm working with, the leaders were responsible for, one of their initiatives was to promote employee trust in leaders. And that's a classic sort of outcome that I always talk about, is not something that your leaders can directly affect. What they need to focus on is how they do what they do in their role as leaders within climate, and how that's shaping the culture and creating the kind of environment where people either trust or not their leadership. Once they understand this relationship, what the point is that they start to realize that of the 10 projects that we have going on, there's actually only 2 or 3 of them that I actually can directly affect myself. And if I can do that effectively, the others will begin to fall into place sort of like dominoes, right? If I can be a more supportive, servant, humanistic, encouraging leader, climate, then I, kind of create the team environment where people understand that they're expected to take part and we value their input and their ideas count, and that we all benefit from the diversity of their input. And it's that kind of environment in the team and organization that causes people to report that I feel like I fit in, I'm valued, I'm trusted, and I thereby trust leadership as well. So anyway, a lot of times for our clients, not only does it help them to understand structurally sort of where all of these initiatives fall, but really which of those they need to put their efforts in and sort of have the most direct influence upon. And then suddenly they realize maybe I don't have 10 projects I'm working on 2 or 3, and the rest of these things are sort of outcomes that I'm expecting to be as a result or part of that process. Okay. I think that's what I had on, point 1. So point 2, moving ahead. We already have surveys. Yes, of course. Every organization I talk to already has their own surveys, so why would they pay for ours? Now, there are a few ways to answer this question. The typical way that we address this in HS is in terms of the quality of the instruments. Organizations obviously can and do develop their own surveys. That makes sense and is helpful in certain instances and perhaps not in others. And this gets back to things like measuring outcomes and KPIs and deliverables versus measuring very challenging things to capture, like the psychological patterns in your organization that are playing out amongst your people, which is what we're capturing as organizational culture, and how those patterns influence, their performance, their well-being, and your business. So there's a whole lot in terms of the research, the reliability, the validity of the tools, and why that hopefully makes them, or does make them, more accurate and useful and sort of trustworthy if you're going to put your efforts in changing based on data, that you use good data. We have a lot on that, so I'm kind of going to skip over that point and get to my other reasons that I think our instruments are helpful even if the organization has their own tools. The first is, honestly, I'm always fascinated to try to get a hold of those questionnaires if I can and have a look at them, because it's interesting to see what organizations are asking about, because it tells you a lot. What leaders want to know tells you a lot about what's going on in the minds of the leadership team. But in any case, in my experience, you usually find that these employee surveys, global employee surveys, that sort of thing, are basically asking what we would consider to be outcome questions around performance and well-being. So how well do you manage your time, manage work-life balance? Do you feel psychologically secure? Do you give extra effort? Are you satisfied? Outcome stuff. Or they're asking climate things. Do you have access to your leader? Does your leader talk to you? Do you know what the goals are? Do you know what your job is? Are you rewarded for good work? Do you know how to learn from failures? Climate stuff. They're not understanding the piece in the middle, and we talk about this in other sessions in terms of how that creates sort of unexpected results when organizations change climate in an attempt to change outcomes without understanding sort of the lens of culture in the middle. In any case, my second point is that they don't have the full picture. And that's really the thing I like about the how culture works model, even if you only use it conceptually, because it gives you the broad picture. And most organizations are asking most questions about outcomes and some questions about climate and not much about anything else. And they're getting a very sort of inconsistent patchwork perspective of what's going on in their business without a cause and effect relationship. So it's unclear in terms of what we need to do in order to make any change. So this is where Australia has one of the greatest quotes about data. I love it because I was really struggling with how to explain this to clients, because most of what they're doing in terms of global employee surveys and KPIs are data points. You're getting good data, but it's just a piece of information. It doesn't give you causal information in terms of why are we seeing what we're seeing and what to do about it. So the classic was always, yes, we ask people how engaged they are. We've been asking about engagement for 5 years. Every year engagement goes down. We have no idea why or what to do about it, but we know that. So, the data gives you information, but the Australian quote is, it gives you information, but doesn't give you wisdom. And that I very much like, because what we're giving you is not just data, but the wisdom in terms of understanding what is causing what I can affect, and what needs to change here in order for this to really change. So that's the second. No, that's everything. Yeah, the cause and effect relationship. And anyway, the next thing that I try to talk about here is, and this gets to the point of data versus, information that gives you wisdom. The tools that they design in the organization are designed to give them information. That's the point. They want to know how satisfied you are or whatever. They want information. Our instruments are designed to create and facilitate change. That's, the purpose of the tools is entirely different. They didn't design their global employee survey, their KPI survey to create change. They designed it to create a dashboard for what they think is important in their employee and business performance. How that's happening and what to do about it is actually a very different question. And that's where our instruments focus. By the way, this is also how we can simplify things for them. So what I mean is, if they're already asking their employees questions, I always try to get a hold of those questions, see what they are, because if they really like the questions they're already asking, many times they do. We value engagement. We want to keep measuring it. We have been measuring it, but we want to understand more about why it is what it is and how to actually change it. Then we can usually take those questions that they've already been using and build them into, for example, an OCI culture project as customized outcomes. And we do this, by the way, for the majority of our clients these days. And then, assuming we have enough data, which is not usually a lot, like 100 participants, we can run correlation analyses between their current culture and their performance criteria. We've talked about this in other Wednesday sessions around how to customize culture projects, but this is a good way to get rid of a few surveys. If you have too many of them, then let's take your 5-question engagement survey and just build it into the OCI. And let's take your, a couple of your KPIs that are key and build those in, and just give people one assessment to complete, rather than harassing them with multiple surveys that don't seem to connect and don't give us any information about why and what to do. Okay. Too many questions. I love this one. Well, I mean, yeah, I get it, right? All of our tools are a bit extensive. It has to do with what we do, and that is we try to. One of the things I'm always interested in is HS's tagline. I mean, the whole changing the world one organization at a time thing. But one of the interesting things is there were other taglines that were recommended. And actually, we reached out to a lot of our clients years ago and asked what our tagline might be. Anyway, we got some feedback, and this one was considered, which was we measure the unmeasurable. And that's, Edgar Schein himself, sort of the guru, at least in the US, of organizational culture, said for decades that you cannot measure this. Now, thankfully, he co-facilitates a lot of our culture workshops in the US and stands up on stage with Dr. Cook and talks about culture and that it can be measured and that OCI is the tool to use, which is great. But the point is that what we're measuring is not engagement or satisfaction. What we're actually, and I, to be honest with you, I boil this down when I talk to clients, even to the extent of sometimes talking about, culture in terms of patterns of behavior in the organization. That's not actually what we're asking. It's not actually what we're capturing. What we're actually asking is around expectations, which is harder to explain, but the patterns amongst your people in terms of what they believe is genuinely expected of them is actually more influential of what's going on than just their behavior. So we're actually measuring a shared psychological pattern across your people. And that's a challenging thing to do in the first place. And it's also challenging to do in a way that is provably scientifically reliable and valid. And that's really our niche. We do have shorter surveys for other things. GSI is a bit shorter than OCI. They're all a bit different. But at the end of the day, the client is going to find our tools to have a few more questions than probably what they've been using. Having said that, I think it's just important to point out why we are trying to get good data here in terms of what's playing out and so on. The other point that I had around, I'm losing my, too many questions is, again, a lot of times replacing surveys, a lot of times we can replace other questions that they're already asking. So if they already have questions around outcomes we're already looking into, or they're asking about leadership in one of their surveys and we're already asking those questions in OEI and climate, then a lot of times those become redundant. And by using one long survey, you can get rid of a couple of your other shorter ones, perhaps. The other thing I always say when people complain about the items is I only get those complaints before the project. I mean, I'm being serious. I got to talk to our account managers. I think I talked to Marie about this. I can't recall ever having a single participant complain about the number of questions that they were asked in the survey. The concern comes up before the project, not actually when it plays out. I think part of that is, I mean, it sounds like a lot of questions and everybody's concerned about that. But on the other side of the coin, if you actually look at what we're asking, it's really one question with various endings, right? So in OCI, we're asking to what extent you are expected to point out flaws, show concern for the needs of others, involve others in decisions that affect them, resolve conflicts constructively, ... So it's a part of a statement, each of the items. It takes people 15 minutes or less to complete the inventory. It's not a big thing. Now, the other thing is, it's never going to be few questions enough. I remember having one client, and this is the way that I really look at it. I had one client in the pharma industry, by the way, who leadership team, and I was talking about, using OCI, and I was in their room with 10 leaders, and one of the leaders pounded his table on the table when he found out OCI has 120 questions. So that's absolutely too many questions. You can't do that. Can't you? The last culture survey, we've already asked our people about cultures. We had 5 questions. We asked them with 5 questions about the culture. Why can't you just ask them 5 questions? And I said, you know what? I'll do it if you promise me the next time you go into the doctor, you only allow him to ask you 5 questions. Only 5 pieces of information, right? How old am I? How much do I weigh? My age, my gender. You got one more, doc, and that's it. You're not going to get any more out of me. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever, right? These are diagnostic tools. The purpose is to get an understanding of what's going on. And since we don't know what's going on, we got to get a good look at things. So anyway, it's a challenging one. But in the back of my head, the other thing is, if 120 questions is going to keep them from creating change and doing this, then don't waste your time anyway, because they're not going to do anything when they get to the report. Because if that's too much time for them to put into this, guess what? The level of that doesn't bode well. But it is a question. Okay. Next one is here's my button. Survey fatigue. I actually left this as a separate point. It sounds like it should be in the other ones, right? Too many surveys, too many questions. Why is this a separate point? Well, we already have surveys. The answer to that, or trying to answer that, is why are our surveys different than what you already have? That's kind of the answer-ish. Too many questions. Well, the answer is what we're capturing and the usefulness of that information to answer this. Survey fatigue, I think, is a different thing. Yes, it happens when organizations ask too many surveys with too many questions, but I think there's a different issue going on when people really complain about survey fatigue. And my immediate question when they say this is too many surveys, we have survey fatigue, is not how many questions or surveys are you asking your people, but what are you doing with the information that you're already gathering? I promise you the answer is probably nothing. Survey fatigue happens when we ask people questions and don't do anything about it. You're teaching your people that they're wasting their time giving their feedback. Their feedback doesn't matter. Nothing's going to change anyway. And you can see it in the response rate because they'll answer that thing less and less every year, and you won't really understand why. Survey fatigue, I honestly believe, has nothing to do with how many questions you're asking. It has to do with what you do with the data. People love being included in these surveys, to be honest with you, especially OCI Ideal. Why? Because we're talking about where we're going and what we want here. And they're listening to me, and I get to voice my opinion on what kind of behavior leaders should be exhibiting and what kind of workplace we want to create. As long as the organization does something with that, people will absolutely answer the surveys and happily do so. What is causing the fatigue is the learned helplessness of answering surveys doesn't do it. It's a waste of time. And that is a problem. And if you're not going to do anything with ours, please don't use it, because you're teaching people, you're reinforcing the same message and the same culture. If you're not going to do anything with this stuff, please don't use it, because it really actually, in my opinion, is more negative to run your people through a survey and not do anything with it than it is just to not do it at all. Okay. Data privacy, GDPR, Jaco. I'll make this short and somewhat painless, although poor Jakob is in this call and it hasn't been painless for him. So GDPR and data privacy is obviously a topic. Of course, I added works councils on here as well in terms of kind of getting them on board and getting their approvals. This has been a moving target for a long time. Thankfully, our office, I have to say, has been pretty proactive around data privacy. Previously, we had Sylvie in our office who specializes in this and got our systems all compliant. And now we have both Jakob and Marie who've gone through special training on these topics and helped to make sure our systems and processes are all compliant. And while we are compliant, and I'm going to keep this short, it still ends up being a conversation with a lot of clients. Everybody seems to have their own concerns, whether it's privacy things or actually GDPR things or works council concerns. Those are actually different things. And every organization seems to have some concern somewhere, and so we have to address that. The point is that we are in order in terms of how we do projects and handle data. We do have support material to explain why this is and how this is all done. But if you get stuck with, internal GDPR concerns or works councils, please feel free to reach out to us. That's something we do help with. So I'll end that here, because the other point is, while this is a very common concern, I would have to say for culture, especially probably 90% plus of our clients ask something around where's the data going, how is it being used otherwise, that sort of thing. I don't know that we've had a single client have to cancel a project or something like that because of GDPR. We've managed to address their concerns, explain what we're doing in a way, maybe make some slight changes to how we do the project, but we can get it done. So don't want to spend time on that one. It is a common question, but one I think we're doing pretty well to address. Okay, the next one is cost and return on investment type topics. So I want to keep these, they're slightly different topics. One is sort of the cost of the instruments, and that's all I'm going to really address, because there are other costs associated with, obviously, leadership, development, culture, and so on. And that's really kind of my first point, because if a client, and it is rare, to be honest with you, but it came up recently, so I wanted to add it to the list. It's fairly rare for clients really to get hung up on pricing. I've talked about pricing with clients for 10 years, and I can honestly remember 2 cases where the client was sort of, that seems a bit much. Most of the responses I actually got were the opposite of, I'm surprised that it's that low. But now here's the thing, and this is important, right? If you actually look at projects from a financial cost perspective, whether you're looking at developing a leader with LWS or leadership impact, or we're looking at addressing culture, whatever it might be, as far as I can sort of guesstimate, the cost of the tools in the scope of the project is less than 20% of the entire investment. You know, the LWS for 275 euros is not, I mean, that's part of the expense, but there's also, you know, a coach that you're going to need to have who's interacting with this person. Even if they're internal, you need someone who's taking their time. So what I mean is, you know, and that's a development journey that's going to take 6 months, and we're going to check in with this person and so on and so forth. So the point is that, you know, so it always worries me when clients are specifically concerned about the cost of the tool, because that's just the start in a way. You know, if that's going to hold you up, once again, if that's the, you know, if the 275 euros for LWS is what's going to stop you from developing your leaders, then maybe this, you know, you're also probably not going to invest the other 80% of what it needs to really make this change. So that's part of how I would preface this conversation. The other point I like to make is, well, it's expensive compared to what? Especially compared to continuing doing what you're doing and carrying out the status quo. By the way, and Jakob, I need to point this out to you as well. We have a really nice article that's, I think was published by Australia, but in any case, it's called The Cost of Maintaining a Defensive Culture. And it was written a while ago, and I know we actually translated it into German, and it's a very good article outlining, and I'll get into this as now we translate into return on investments, but outlining the kind of costs, and they are pretty tremendous, associated with trying to achieve great results and perform with defensive culture styles. I mean, when people talk to me, and I've talked to leaders about this, you know, no matter what the expense of the tool, there is nothing more expensive than defensive culture styles. You know, your people working against one another, your people not speaking up, not taking part, avoiding participating in their own work. I mean, that's costing your business. This, you know, keeping things in perspective. Okay, which brings us to return on investments, which is something that HS is looked into for quite a while. The point is how, in a lot of cases, clients will say things like, well, what's the return on investment? How do we know this is worth what we're putting into it? We do actually have cases that demonstrate this, but I like to try to customize it for the individual client. I'll tell you how this has been done in the past, and it usually has to do with their own KPIs. There are ways of doing this with actual financial performance, sales numbers, those sorts of things. They're a little more challenging. I can talk maybe later about how that's done if that's what you're looking for. But for most of our clients, you know, by the time they're talking to us about leadership and culture development, they understand that KPIs like engagement and burnout rates and the cost of hiring new employees to replace those that we lose, they recognize that those things have a financial cost. And I've worked with consultants who do exactly this. So they go in and they ask about these kinds of costs. And then, I mean, there are numbers out there that are published around the extent to which engagement promotes, you know, employee contribution and profitability of the business. If that's the assumption that they're going on, then fine, then we'll use engagement as sort of one of those KPIs. And then you can calculate at the end of this the extent to which engagement's improved and thereby the benefit financially. Most of our organizations that we've done this with in the past have tried to focus on as hard financial outcomes as they can. And those are usually pretty quantifiable things like turnover rates, burnout rates, yeah, the loss of your kind of best and brightest to the competition, those things that they can recognize. How much does it cost you to hire, you know, new people every year to this team and retrain them? And usually you can put a number on that. And in every instance I have ever seen, again, as long as development is created, those numbers improve. And I know consultants who have used this as part of their, I mean, as a real focus of their strategy, going in, identifying the financial KPIs that the organization is interested in, finding a way to identify those in terms of like what I'm talking about, burnout, turnover rates and so on, and then use this. And I've even had consultants who will guarantee to the client that they'll make a return on the investment after, it depends on the size, but 18 to 24 months, or they'll do the project for free and they've never had to do it. As long as, you know, you get good information, we take action, we can really affect these things. It's not maybe my favorite way to talk about culture projects. It's actually certainly not. It's very outcome focused, and it's kind of dangerous that the organization is putting so much of a focus on financial performance alone. It's usually how you get off track with various leadership and cultural things along the way. But it is something that we can assess. It is something that we can customize and build in and give them feedback on that. They just need to understand how, you tell us what's costing you in your organization, because maintaining that kind of turnover and so on is very expensive. Good. I remember one example related to this with sales teams. I'll give you this one and then move on. So a consultant went into an organization and basically said, I can help your sales teams to be more effective, not just selling more, but having their customers be more satisfied and working better together and sharing learned lessons and all good things. And the organization said, well, let's see, let's have you look at 10 different sales teams and you tell us, what you find. So they did these little OCI projects with 10 different sales teams, and it was just sort of supposed to be like a random sample. And what they asked for was just the current culture profile for each of those teams. You could have used GSI, probably more appropriate, but anyway. And so the organization printed out these 10 profiles on pieces of paper and had them all laid out on a table with the leadership team. And the consultant came in and the leadership team said, what can you tell us? And the consultant walked around and he found the most blue team profile. Didn't know what team it was, just blue. And he held it up and he said, well, this team is goal oriented. They work towards goals. They get things done. They're high performing. They learn. They've been improving. I'm betting their sales numbers have been trending positively. Their customers are very satisfied. They enjoy working here. They're satisfied. They're engaged. This is a high performing team. And the organization said, yeah, and in fact, it's our best sales team and they do have the best customer feedback. And that's exactly correct. And it's great. And then he walked around the table and he found the most defensive profile, just red and green, and picked it up and said, well, this team, a bit of the opposite, right? This team, it's much more about winning against one another and undermining each other's efforts and trying to take credit for each other's work. They're not sharing information, learning from each other. When things get tough, they don't help. They just sit back. All sorts of problems go. They must be losing the organization money. They're not servicing customers well. There's all sorts of issues. Exactly right. That was all the things that they were finding in their KPIs. The issue was they'd been trying to develop that sales team for the past 5 years. We've been sending in consultants. We've been sending in new leaders. We can't seem to change it. And to be honest with you, not only has it been costing us a tremendous amount of money, but we had to shut down that department, that location, because it was doing nothing but losing money and we couldn't seem to change it. That's a pretty good return on investment if we can, turn those kinds of teams around. And those are the kinds of costs that, that can connect. Good. The last thing in terms of cost, I'm not going to get into the fact that we have discounts and all that sort of thing, but the last thing I would say if cost is an issue is then just start small. Believe me, that every client that I really talk to after they use these tools will tell me that what we got out of it was so much more valuable than the financial cost of doing getting the data in the first place. It's hugely beneficial. And once they recognize that, the concerns about cost sort of disappear. So in that case, then start small. If we can't, a whole culture initiative is way too much financially, then let's start with leadership teams. Can we work with 1 or 2 teams and really see what's going on and develop them and improve and see if it's worth it to you? And by the way, that's probably how we've developed and reached a point where we work at the cultural level with most of our clients. They don't reach out and say, let's look at everything and assess everything. And we want OCI and ideal and OEI top to bottom. It doesn't happen. They're interested in the topic. They recognize it's relevant. We try it out in a team. We create really positive change and improvement. They start to realize this is a good thing. And then we start to cascade this from 1 team to 10 teams to across. And then we get into the topic of culture. So, and at that point, we're stepping into this. And at that point, the costs we can demonstrate are appropriate given the benefit of the instruments. So if that is a real concern, then start small so we can show them what the benefits are before they're asked to commit more resources. Okay, then Trying to stay on track here. Point 7, I can't sell this to leadership. So this is obviously the kind of question we would get from HR, OD, learning and development type org part of the business who's been tasked with, looking at culture or creating a more engaging, innovative work environment. And they reach out to us and get some information and get very interested, but then are concerned to how do I sell this to leadership? So this is challenging because, to be honest with you, I recognize that HS tools and models and what we do is difficult to explain. And while I feel like usually if I get people on a Zoom call for an hour or two, I can get across the idea of what we do, it's a whole other thing for that individual to then try to turn around and explain it to senior leadership teams of why this is relevant and why we should do this. So, a few tricks to helping address that. The first is to try to figure out what the leadership team is interested in. A lot of times when it's HR and OD and learning and development that's approaching us, they're approaching us with what I would call organizational level outcomes. They're approaching us because employees are not engaged, or we're not adaptive, or we're losing customer whatever. It's broader performance. And while that's relevant, if you think of things like LSI and LWS, and when I talk about leadership coaching, I always say that you really want to have two goals. You want the goal for why we as a leadership team in this company are using this tool, whether it's to be more, whatever, to live the values or create more engaged in work environments. There's a reason why we are doing this. There should also be a reason why I am doing this. And that's part of the questions that we include in the workbook when we give you an LSI or LWS report, that we should be asking leaders, and where are you now in your position? What do you wish was different? And what would you change? And that kind of thing. The reason for this is, before we get to the point where we need to implement change, we need everybody on board. And if leadership might not be on board, then we need to help them to recognize how this might pay off for them. So what I'm suggesting is that we may have some good outcomes from the business that are relevant and important to leaders, but maybe it's good to go back to the leaders and say, look, if we're going to embark on a culture journey, what do you wish was different about how we work here? And a lot of times that's things that are so easily, we want a more engaging, creative culture. Okay, and what does the leadership team wish was different? Well, we wish that we had more proactive employees who didn't depend on us to answer every question for them and to tell them what to do. Great, that's the perfect kind of thing that we can build into this journey, so that we're not only creating as we create a more constructive culture, we're not only creating the kind of place where people understand how to be creative and innovative in their job, but they're also, as they understand that, becoming less dependent on leaders to tell them what to do. And now we're fulfilling the goals of the organization and hopefully the goals of the leadership team at the same time. So that's a big part of it, I think, is to try to figure out what is their objective, what would get them interested in really taking part in this. And try to identify that. So anyway, that's the leadership team. The next point I make is, if you are talking to people inside the organization about this, and to reiterate, Sean McCarthy's stages of organizational consciousness might be very helpful to you. I gave that presentation on a Wednesday call a while ago, and I got really nice feedback, but it was fascinating because the most enthusiastic feedback that I got was from people within organizations who were trying to explain this to their leadership team. And by being able to recognize sort of where our leaders are in their awareness of culture and what it's about and the benefits of it, allowed them to sort of focus their I don't want to say sales pitch, but their conversation with leaders around what they can recognize, what they're aware of, and sort of address where they are, if that makes sense. So that can be helpful. Again, leadership teams are usually, in my experience, a little bit outcome oriented. So again, let's figure out what they really pay attention to, what's going to get their attention. I always say, and this is, again, typically KPI type things of, our engagements decreasing, whatever it is, we need to get a hold of that. I always say, when I talk to clients about culture development and team development, that you want to ask a lot about why we're doing this, because the risk is one of the risky places in project processes and this whole journey is when clients, I always say, when they get their reports. If you look at this in terms of a big timeline, the riskiest place is that they get their report, they read through it, and then they just don't do anything with it. That's kind of the make or break point for organizations, leaders, and teams, and all of us, right? We go to the doctor, we get information about what we might change to be healthier, we go home, and then we either do it or we don't. That's the make or the break point. So again, what's going to get leaders' attention? I always like to talk to leaders and say, you know, do you have a global employee survey? Do you have 4 or 5 things on that survey that really keep you up at night, that you really have been trying to affect or change and cannot? You know, what are those things? And build those in, because at the end of this project, when they get the report, and they start looking at where our culture is and where we want to go and whatever it is, they're going to start realizing that it's going to take more investment than the cost of the tool to create this change. And if we're only doing it for one reason, engagement, then maybe it's not worth it. You know what I mean? But if we can start to see that by moving in this direction, it would not only lead to more engaged people, but a more creative workplace where customers are more satisfied and we're living the values and leaders are described as more trustworthy and we have a more collaborative, then suddenly we're starting to tick enough of the boxes that we really can't ignore the fact that we should change and grow and improve. So anyway, those are a few of my points. Again, also in terms of getting leaders on board, the conversation we had before about return on investment might be a good one to have. Last point on leaders and how to get them on board. In my opinion, honestly, leaders love this information, at least once they understand what we're giving them, because they're aware of performance. They've been looking at KPIs for decades. They know what they want to achieve. The challenge and the frustration is how to create it and what are we doing wrong and why are things going in directions we don't want them to go. And that's the information that we're giving them. We're not giving them information about what you're doing wrong or how you're a poor leader. We're giving them information about the things that are preventing you from creating the kind of workplace that you say you want to create or being the kind of leader that you want to be. And by understanding that, then we can make informed change and change all of this. And for the leaders who get it, this is wonderful because it's empowering information. Again, it's information designed to create change, not just information intended to inform you. Leaders, in my opinion, are overwhelmed with information intended to inform you. They're very informed. The issue is, how does it all stick together? Where do we start first? What's the priority? And what do I do? And that's exactly what our tools are designed to try to deliver. Point 8, we're getting there. We're running out of time. So this will confuse our people. This mainly came up recently around an OCI ideal project. The idea, and this goes back to a previous point, that we're adding another survey and we already have values on the wall. So why do we need to ask people about what the culture should be? Isn't that redundant and won't it confuse people? First of all, I hope you can give your people a little more credit than that. I don't think that's what's going to confuse your people. I think what confuses people are different goals and unclear objectives and inconsistent feedback and poor job design. That's what confuses people. Not that we're asking them what kind of workplace they want to work in. Anyway, is it redundant? I would again say no. Your values are your values, and we don't disagree with that. What I would suggest the OCI ideal is a description of how we live those values, or what kind of culture in this business is consistent with those values. That's a different thing. What are our values and how do we live that? That is what you want to then compare to what are we doing right now, and that's current culture. And why I always say that the comparison of your current culture to your ideal is very much the comparison of, are we walking the talk? To what extent are we living the values? And a good example of very useful information, but not the kind of thing that you can answer with 4 questions, right? And that's the purpose of OCI ideal. To give people a comparison point of not only where are we now, but what is it to live those values? How do we do that so that we can bridge and move in that direction? Point 9 is this can't be done. Can't happen here. It won't happen. No chance. Now that's an interesting one, and sometimes they're right, unfortunately, but it doesn't have to be that way. These things can change. Now, I'm going to make a caveat here. If it can't be done, I'm going to say, let's exclude leadership from this. If it can't be done because leaders aren't on board or leaders won't support it, then move up 2 points, please, and let's talk to the leadership team. If it's other than the leaders, we still say it can't be done, then usually we're referring to one of two things. Either usually one thing, it's climate stuff. We believe that this organization only functions if, and a lot of times you'll get this from banks and financial organizations with respect to things like compliance. Yeah, we'd love to be creative and have people experiment on their job. That'd be lovely. But we have all this compliance, and if people make mistakes, it's going to cost us. And therefore, we can't let people make mistakes, so we can't let people experiment. That is a common kind of association, but it's incomplete again. If you think about compliance in terms of climate, of course, that's important, but it's only part of what shapes an organization's culture. And defensive behavior doesn't help your people to be more compliant and effective in following those kinds of guidelines. So a lot of this takes some explaining to people and how this still works in their industry or in their organization. But it certainly can be done, even if we have a few hard limits in terms of how the business is designed, structured, and so on. All right, wrapping up. 10, this will take too long. Yeah, I love this one. Yes, culture development takes time. All development takes time, but it never takes more time than if you don't get started, right? I mean, this is sort of a silly argument. Yeah, it's going to take too long. Well, yeah, but if the longer you take to take the first step, the longer you're delaying the whole, that's the issue. In my experience, that's, we talk a lot about the fact that it takes time to change culture. And what we're really talking about is it takes time to change the perception that people have about what is honestly, truly expected of them in their role in this business. Yeah, that takes time. But in my experience, honestly, when you look at the journey, it takes more time for us to learn from the report and the data, identify what we need to do, and to take those steps. I actually wrote this out very briefly of a client journey because it took them 9 years, an example of taking too much time, 9 years to increase their constructive styles by 15 to 20%. That's the kind of development I would have expected in that size of an organization in 12 months or less, right? So it does take time, but it doesn't have to take that much time. Why did it take this organization so much time? Well, the first year, culture wasn't really a priority. They were just thinking about culture in terms of other things they were doing, so they were dabbling. So they met us and we tried out OCI. The next year, they realized that, hey, this tool really does work. It actually does look at how we work, and it does predict how effectively we perform. And when we develop this team, the team really does do better. And well, hey, this is a great thing. Year 3, we tried to get other teams to get on board and do this, but there was so much resistance, it took us a whole year to get the other leadership teams to get on board. Year 4, we have to prove the whole thing again. This does work. This does measure our team. This does predict. Okay, this is a good thing. And you're teaching and learning the same kind of lesson again and again in the organization, and it takes a very long time to cascade that. And that has to do a lot with what the organization does and how they align their strategies and how leaders are on board and how they design and implement that change journey. It will take time, but it doesn't have to take that much time. There's a whole lot that can be done to expedite these things. In any case, I think that was mostly for point 10. And the last one that I had, just so we don't run out of time completely, is what if we get bad results? And to be honest with you, this I believe is kind of behind many of these other questions and why organizations honestly are apprehensive of diagnostics, because if these things are so darned accurate and valid, then they're gonna find something I'm doing wrong and it's not going to look good. Now, that's obviously not the purpose of the tool, but it is a big risk, because the more people perceive the risk that these instruments are going to give them feedback that is negative in terms of what I'm doing as a leader or what I'm creating in my people or what the culture is wrong or any of those sorts of things, then obviously they will be very hesitant to use the tools. The point is obviously to hopefully help the client to not see this as bad news, which it's really not. And I always say, look, if you open a report, I'm going to end with this. If you open a report and you know that this is not good, bad, this is styles, and they may influence things in positive and negative ways, and we could do better and all that. It's not good and bad, but you still can't help it. You open the report and it's all red and green, and my people are stressed and they don't trust leadership, and this is a mess, this is bad, I can't help looking at it this way. If that's where you are, then fine, but change it. I always say this about HS tools. If you open the report and you find something you don't like, change it. That's entirely the purpose of the report, is not to give you negative feedback. It's to let you know what's going on so that you can change it. So that's what I really like. It's a very empowering kind of concept that, hey, we give you good information, but at the end of the day, you can change everything in that report if you do something with it.